Well, hey, this is Dan from learningcameras.com, and here it is. We've got the 5D Mark III up against the brand new Nikon D600. Now, this is a very important test for a couple of reasons. One is that as of now, Canon doesn't have a 6D or anything similar to the Nikon D600 available. So, if you're looking at this camera and you're up against Canon, you want to see the only full-frame camera that Canon has on the market now. Obviously, they have the 5D Mark II still available, but this is a new beast, and this is probably going to be the same technology that the 6D will follow. So let's see what Canon's full-frame camera and Nikon's full-frame camera can do to each other. Now, as we take a look around the camera, these are really two different beasts of camera. The Nikon is a lot smaller than the Canon. There is a pretty considerable difference in size. Now, most notably, the actual grip is going to be much smaller than on the Canon, and the controls are going to be more suited to a pro type level of control on the Canon than the Nikon. That's because this is really meant to be a smaller, more portable camera, and the Canon 5D III is really meant to go into areas such as weddings or event photography or in the studio and things like that, where all those controls are needed. So on the outside, these are two pretty big different breeds of camera, but there's going to be a lot of similarities, and one is the fact that the Nikon actually has dual SD card slots compared to Canon's dual. Now, one is compact flash in the Canon, but it still has two card slots. That's something new that Canon doesn't have in a lot of their other models, that Nikon does have and bring into their models. Now, something else is actually that this one does have a pop-up flash. Now, the Canon 7D does, but the new 6D will not, and the Canon does not. Now, it's not a huge deal for most people, but it can work to help gain autofocus, and there is an autofocus help assist light right here, and the Canon does not have that. And so that can happen and help during some dark environments. Now, as far as the cameras go, we have a 24 megapixel camera on the Nikon and a 22 megapixel camera in the Canon. Autofocus wise, you do have a very big similarities between them. But one thing I like about the Canon is that all of the cross central type focus points, and there's 41 on this camera, there's only 9 on this one, are located and spread throughout the camera, whereas Nikon puts them in the center. Now, you don't have quite the controls that a D800 has on Nikon, which is why this is kind of an unfair comparison, but we're going to take a look at some of the advantages of this camera. The body is very easy to hold, very lightweight. I would have this around my neck all day long. That's an advantage for somebody taking this out into the field where they want a lightweight camera, or they want to be a little less conspicuous, or they're just looking for a travel photo camera. Whereas the Canon is a little bit beefier. They're both going to have a magnesium alloy body. You're going to find it all the way around on the Canon, whereas the Nikon is mostly just the back and the sides. On the top where the flash is, and on the front it is a plastic, but it still feels great in the hand. It's a little small for me, but once again, that size difference is going to be very, very nice when you're taking this on the road. Now, so here we have our test fixture. We've got a 5D Mark III on the right with the 24-70 2.8, and we've got the Nikon D600 on the left. We've got the 24-85. It's an f3.5 to 4.5. We're shooting them both at, I believe it's f8. We're going to shoot them both at f8 to try to make sure that we have everything about as similar as possible. And what we're also going to do is we're going to keep them both at 35 millimeters on the lens, so that we're not putting any extremes on it. These are both raw files. And now when we look at the back of the screen, we're actually able to see quite a bit of a difference between the colors of these two images. Even though we have the white balances set the same, both of these are raw files being recorded. So we'll take a look and see what the differences are when we put those up on the computer, and if it maybe is just a screen. The Canon 5D III is showing a little more of a burgundy tint, while this looks a little bit more greenish yellow. Now, we did see that kind of phenomenon on the D800, so maybe there is something related to the screen that Nikon is putting inside of its cameras. Now, in taking a look at the crop of both the Nikon and the Canon of the close-up on the wall, it's pretty difficult to see virtually any difference between the two, even with the 1 to 2 megapixel advantage that the Nikon has on it. both files look just about identical on screen. Now we can see a little bit of difference in how they rendered the white balance, and overall I think the Canon was a little more true to what we were seeing outside at the time. Now another big area of concern for these cameras is going to be dynamic range. Now both of these cameras are full frame cameras, so they're going to be matched pretty evenly. Now the Canon 5D3 is a little bit more of a professional body, but as far as the sensor is concerned, these cameras are going to be equal. Also, Canon doesn't have the 6D out at the time I'm shooting this video, and so we don't have that exact comparison for them. So this is the only full frame camera that's even close to the D600 that Canon has available. So what we're going to do is take these two shots, and we're exposing basically for the highlights of these two shots. And we're going to see how much of that we can rescue inside of the shadows. Now what I'm going to do also is we took that one at ISO 100, and then we're going to take one more at ISO 400 on both of these and just see if there's any bit of difference between those. Now when I did that, I started out at 100 on the shutter speed, so I'm going to go to 400 right now, and that should keep everything exactly even. Now just for one more comparison, we're going to take that ISO and we're going to drive it up to 800, and we're going to bring those shutter speeds up, and we're going to see if that is able to make a difference on these two sensors, and if there is anything that the Canon or Nikon does any differently at any of these settings. So overall, when we look in the back of the screens, at least, we are still seeing that more burgundy tint on this one and a more greenish yellow tint on this one. Now on the wall test, this actually looked a little bit more accurate, but there is a little bit of green in this scene, and so it actually looks like the Nikon might not be too bad on a scene like this, where it does lend itself to those green colors. Now our third test for these cameras is going to see how they perform at very high ISOs. Both of these cameras are very capable. We go up to 6400 on the Nikon natively. The D800 performs very well, and so the 24 megapixel downside could only probably help the D800 unless Nikon has crippled it in some other way. Now we are able to go to 25,000 natively on the Canon 5D3, so let's see if that amounts to a actual ISO advantage for the Canon 5D3, or if that's just marketing on there. Now we're going to start both of these cameras out at the same settings. They're both at 1/80th of a second f8 at ISO 800. Both of the white balances are set to Kelvin even, and they're both recording raw files without any kind of noise reduction, and we'll see how that does. Now one thing I will say is I can keep the screen on the Canon for this test, which helps me a lot. For the Nikon, the only way for me to see exposure readings is to see inside of the viewfinder, or to keep hitting this info button on the back of the LCD every time I take a shot. This is very helpful on the Canon because this is not a very comfortable position to put your eye up to the viewfinder to see the exposure levels, and so that makes it very nice when I can keep the screen on in the Canon. But let's take some shots and see how those perform. Now also for this test, we're going to go ahead and boost up those ISO levels on this camera. We're going to go to 1600 on both of these cameras, and once again I have to look way up here on the Nikon, or else I have to press that info button on it, and I'm going to have to do that now because I really can't see the shutter at all. And we're going to take that up to 1/60th of a second, and we're going to retake those pictures. Both of these are taken at f8. Now also we're going to take that ISO, and once again I have to hit the info button in order to get that up there, and this is why it's a little big of an issue for me. It's that there's no way to do it without one extra step. We're going to double our shutter speed again, and we're going to take those at 320. And for one last test, we're going to go ahead and take it to ISO 6400 on that camera, and we're going to go to ISO 6400 on the Canon, and we're going to double our shutter speed up one more time. And here we go for our very last test. Now in taking a look at the files, both of these cameras are so good at high ISOs that in a test like this, this is 6400 ISO, a 100% crop. You can hardly see anything in both of these pictures in this kind of settings. We're going to have to take something with a little bit more shadows in a worse lit environment in order to be able to see any issues with the image. Even at 6400 ISO, the grain is minimal. It's easily reduced in something like Lightroom or with some kind of noise filter, and definitely isn't distracting to a big point on a test like this. So we'll go ahead and do some more real-life examples, and we'll see some of the grain that shows up in worse lighting conditions. Now, one last thing I'd like to show you on these two cameras is when we put them both into live view mode, either for video or for photography, and we try to focus these cameras manually or just to zoom in to see what's going on at 10x zoom, we're unable to get a very good picture on the D600 just because as we scroll it's very choppy, whereas a Canon is very smooth. If you're trying to focus on a moving object, it's very, very easy with this camera, whereas on this one it's very hard to get a fix on an object. Now, this is even a bigger issue for those who are shooting video who want to get a nice look on a moving subject, or a subject that might be a little bit more difficult to track just because you can't really track with the viewfinder moving that slowly. Also, there's no readout to see how far zoomed in I am, whereas on the Canon there is, and that's been a little bit of an issue for finding everything. If we hit the info button, it actually doesn't display anything on the screen. So here we are, and we're going to do another dynamic range test just to see if there's any difference between these two cameras and the amount of shadows that they're able to hold on to. Here we have a lot of shadows, we have a lot of highlights. This is pretty much a challenge to about every camera. Now, these are both full frames, so they're going to handle it a little bit better than some of the other cameras, like the 7D that I'm recording on. But we're going to see how they do, even if we push them to the edges. Now, as we take a look at both of these pictures, they both look very even. Both the Canon and Nikon resolved the scene perfectly. Now, we can also see that the shadows are a little underexposed, and I had to do that to keep most of the highlights in there. So let's see what happens when these files are pushed into kind of an HDR type manner. Now, when we do that, we can see that both the Canon and the Nikon are able to bring back a lot of that detail. It looks like a Nikon might have brought back a little bit more in the shadows than the Canon, but both files look very, very good. Now, as we take a look at 100% crop of those, this is where we can see the advantage that the Nikon files seem to have. The blacks on them stay very black, and we can't see any kind of grain or banding that's in those pictures. Now, this is 100% crop, but we can see the Canon is more of a dark brown in those shadow areas, and does have a tiny bit of banding that we're able to see. Now, this is still a perfectly usable file, and even the 100% crop, the difference is mild, but it does help that we can have that detail still in the Nikon file, even with the shadows boosted to 100 and the highlights brought down 100%. Now, as we take a look at another scene, this one's even more difficult for these cameras to resolve. I had to underexpose the ground area by even more in order to keep those highlights in the sky. So let's try to boost both of those levels, and we see that both of these cameras are also able to resolve this scene pretty well. The Nikon does look a little bit better on the ground than the Canon, but the difference is fairly minor, except when you put them side by side together. Now, when we take a look at 100% crop, we can see that same thing where the blacks stay very dark on the Nikon. It really looks like this was the original file from this. Whereas on the Canon, they're more of a dark brown and have a little bit of that orangey red tint to them. Once again, this is 100% crop. This is the best Canon that I've seen put up to this. The 5D2 and the 7D did not fare as well in this test, but the 5D3 is almost able to do what the Nikon can do with these files. But when it comes to dynamic range and pushing the darks and the highlights down, it seems like the Nikon D600 is going to be a little bit better in those shadow areas when boosted to about 100%. Now, I did take both of these cameras into a wedding that I shot over the weekend, and it's very clear to tell that while both of these cameras have exceptional picture quality, one of these is made for the professional environment, and the other one, as much as the specs look like a professional camera, it's just really not meant to be held in a quick changing, fast-paced environment. It was a little clunky trying to change some of the controls on the Nikon. I accidentally did a couple little changes on my RAW to JPEG just because the buttons are shared by both the zoom and the RAW or JPEG picture quality option, as well as the ISO. that is shared by another button. Because the buttons are shared, it's a little difficult to make quick setting changes, and it's a little clunky to use in some cases. While the 5D3 on the Canon has individual button controls, a lot of manual options for overriding different styles, different button controls, the function buttons. It's really just made to be a professional camera in that environment. Now, that's not to say that the Nikon D600 didn't perform adequately. It definitely did. I took both of these cameras into a bar to film the bride and groom, and we were shooting at 12,800 ISO in these settings. The Nikon D600 performed very well, and it stood up mostly up to 6,400, but I did get a couple usable ones at 12,800. The Canon 5D3 did perform a little bit better for me. My 12,800 files looked pretty good, and even my 25,000 files were almost usable for most environments, and if I was putting them just on the web, I'd probably be okay with them. So we're looking at about a half a stop better performance, in my opinion, on the 5D3, but the Nikon D600 did offer incredible quality for the price of this camera compared to the price of this camera. Now, our very last test is going to be for video on these two cameras. Now, both of them are recording at 1080p. We've got it at 30 frames a second for this test. We don't want any kind of 24 frames a second. We are shooting moving things, so I'm just going to give it to you at 30 frames a second. Now, we've got both of these at a 60th of a second because of that, and f8. They are at ISO 400, and we do have these pre-focus. Now, we aren't shooting on Canon's high frame rate version. They do have a higher frame rate, or not a higher frame rate, but a higher bit rate format. Now, we aren't doing that because the Nikon has a big advantage too, and that is that it has HDMI out that's clean, so we can hook this up to a recorder and get even better than we could on the Canon. So we're just going to go with the default for both of them just to see if there's any difference directly with the cameras other than the formats. Now, even though the Nikon D600 has a spec list that's comparable with many of the full-frame monster cameras such as the Nikon D800 and the Canon 5D3, it just didn't quite live up to expectations for anyone who was going to be using a camera in this field. Now, many people argue that the Nikon D600 isn't meant for this. Definitely the Canon 6D is not meant for this environment. It was pretty obvious when they introduced something like Wi-Fi and GPS, and then withheld a lot of the main features that a pro would want, like dual memory card slots and a more advanced autofocus system. But Nikon really stuck a lot of those into this camera, so I had a lot of hope for this keeping up with with this camera right here, keeping up with the 5D3 and the Nikon D800. Overall, though, it was a little bit clumsy in use for this environment. However, if you're looking for something that's more travel size, that's a consumer-based camera, except it's $2,200 even for the body, it does take unbelievable pictures. Your ISO quality is amazing, dynamic range is amazing. These files can be pushed to great limits in this camera. If you don't need the quick functionality, you do get the dual memory card slots. You do also have a very advanced focusing system. But even though Nikon is stuck in these features, there are just some limitations that keep it from being this pro-level camera.